The Misfits.
When I was a little girl, I always believed in God. I don't think I had a defining moment where I became a Christian. I just always knew God was there. And I remember when I was 8 years old, it was still in those days when your parents would let you walk to the mall by yourself. And it's like, yes, she's awake. And if she goes to the mall, I get to sleep in more. So my mom would let me walk to the mall. I would have a quarter for a chocolate bar. And the whole way there, I would just be talking to Jesus because I had learned in Sunday school this verse where Jesus said that he had called us friends. And I figured if he was my friend, then he wanted to know everything about me. And so I would talk to him about who was speaking to me at lunch and who wasn't and how I felt. And I just knew God was there. And I had the best walks with Jesus as a kid. And over my life, as I've gone through a lot, we had a son who passed away. Our middle child passed away. I've had a lot of church hurt, just trying to process how it is that so many people who claim to be Christian don't seem to care when people, and especially women, are being hurt. And I've had to leave churches over it. And you just start to feel like, does God even hear this? Does God even see this? Why is God not doing something? And when I get like that, I still take walks and I still just feel God there. And that has traveled with me ever since I was a kid. And I think that experience of knowing God is so important. So often we make faith into a logical thing. And yes, we need doctrine. I'm absolutely all about doctrine. But we also need that experience because sometimes, even in the midst of doubts, even when people hurt us, it's that experience that I can't shake. I knew God was real when I was 8. And so I know God was real when I was 28, when I was grieving, when I was 48, and when I'll be 68, 78, 88. I still know that I'll be able to take walks with God and yell at God sometimes because David did that too. And that was okay with God. He just wants to know us. And that's really been the story of my life, just walks with Jesus.
All right. Hi, I'm also going to take a little minute to introduce myself because I'm also actually new to this podcast. I've done some announcements and things for them, but I haven't actually hosted before. So I am Karen Browning, and how I got involved with this and with asking you to come talk with us is I was offered an opportunity to lead we call them summer studies at our church. And I could pick the topic. And I feel like the topic of sex is not often brought up in the church. And I was kind of looking around and I was like, well, if no one else is going to do it, I'm willing to talk about it. I am a nurse midwife for my job. And so the topic itself is not unfamiliar to me, nor am I, afraid to talk about it or uncomfortable talking about it, as some people are. But I also did grow up in an evangelical church, hearing a lot of the messages of purity culture as well. So I got to live through that and start working through that on my own. And as I started telling friends and family that I was going to be leading this study, everyone, okay, maybe not everyone, a lot of women were like, have you read The Great Sex Rescue?
Yes. New, so you can't even see it. Here we go.
There it is, which I had not at the time. So I started reading it in preparation for leading a group of people through starting to heal from some of the messages that we had been taught when we were younger. And it was definitely one of the main resources that I used for that. So I do want to start out with saying thank you for the work that you stepped into. I know that it's not always easy and it's not always rewarding in the ways that you would want it to be. So thank you for kind of being a face for this that needs said.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome. So also today I am speaking with Sheila Wray Gregoire, who is an author, blogger, speaker, and co-authored The Great Sex Rescue and She Deserves Better, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, would you mind telling us a little bit about how you got started? How did this become one of your topics?
Okay, so in 2008, I wanted to get some bigger publishers. I wanted to write some Christian self-help books. So I started blogging because that's what everyone's supposed to do. So I was talking about parenting and marriage and organizing and housework and all the things all the mommy blogs did. But the more I talked about sex, the more my traffic grew. And so I kind of became the sex place on the internet, which was weird. Like no one grows up thinking I want to be the Christian sex lady. But I became the Christian sex lady and I wrote a couple of books about sex. Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex. The first edition was out in 2012. I wrote 31 Days to Great Sex. And I was giving all the sex advice all the time, like the stuff that I knew was healthy. But people kept having a lot of similar problems, and it didn't seem like they were getting better. And we were trying to figure out how to address this and what we were going to do. And then in January of 2019, it was a Friday afternoon. I had a migraine. I didn't want to work, and I was on Twitter, and I jumped into this conversation where people were debating whether they needed love or respect, and they were referring to Emerson Eggerich's book Love and Respect, which claims that women need love while men need respect. And I thought, I have that book, and I've never read it, and this is a great way to procrastinate. So I got the book, and I opened to the sex chapter, and it was like a nuclear bomb went off in my living room because it was so bad. Like it said, if your husband is typical, he has a need that you don't have. And the need is for physical release. He needs physical release the way she needs emotional release. I don't even know what that means. Like, what is emotional release? But whatever. Okay, so he needs physical release. So sex is all about his climax. Hers is never mentioned, not a single word about pleasure. But if he doesn't get physical release, he'll come under satanic attack. And that was the entire message. And I said to my team, like, we've got to do something. And that's really what started our change in focus. Because until then, we were all about how to give good advice. But I hadn't read what other books were saying. I assumed they love Jesus, I love Jesus. We're all saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when I sat down and actually read the other books, I realized, holy cow, no wonder people have issues if this is what we're teaching. So we've decided to take an evidence-based approach. We've surveyed 32,000 people in total now for all of our books, and with more on the way, to look at how evangelical teachings have really affected, especially women's marital and sexual satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. In your research, is there anything that stood out to you that you were surprised about? Anything that came up that you weren't expecting?
The one big area where I changed my teaching was this idea of libido and frequency. So I used to do the typical thing like, come on, sex is amazing. Sex is awesome in your marriage. Like if you don't want it, let's figure out why. Let's have sex more. Let's celebrate this. Let's do it more. And then we looked at the data and it's like, oh, okay. So I'm gonna list 5 things for you, everyone. Okay, so get ready. When women are frequently reaching orgasm, when there's high marital satisfaction, when there's no porn use in the marriage, when they feel emotionally connected during sex, and when there's no sexual dysfunction, frequency takes care of itself. So it's like libido is a symptom of something else that's going on. It isn't a thing in and of itself. And that was a big change in how we talked about it. Like I knew obligation sex was bad, but I didn't realize how bad it was until we looked at the data. It's like, okay, we really need to change the focus here because there's a reason that Christian women have lower libido. And it's not all women, by the way. Like a lot of women have the higher libido, and we never talk about that either.
Right.
But when women do have a lower libido, it's like it's not out of nowhere. There's a reason, and a lot of it is because of how we're teaching about sex.
Right. And then it becomes a cyclical thing.
Yep.
One of the things that I noticed in reading The Great Sex Rescue is that even if we don't believe the things that we're taught through purity culture and mainstream evangelical teaching on this, that we are still affected by hearing the message. That was fascinating to me. In physical and practical ways, we're affected by what we surround ourselves with, which I think is a bigger scope thing than just talking about sex. But in our Christian walks, like, what are we listening to? Where are we getting, our advice, our information, things like that too. But that was one of the things that stood out to me.
Yeah, like not all of the negative beliefs that we measured were harmful if you only heard them, but some of them really were. Like the idea that all men struggle with lust, it's every man's battle. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
even if she never believed that, even if she merely heard it, it still affects her trust in her husband and her libido down the road. Like that's huge. This is a really toxic message, and I wonder how much of that, this is what we've talked about as a team, and we're trying to, tease out like what's actually going on. I wonder if it's because if she's been taught it, she's growing up in an environment where other people believe it. And so they're just kind of creepy and treating her badly. And so even if she doesn't believe it, her experience of other people is just kind of gross. Like if you're
Mm-hmm.
surrounded by men who think it is natural to lust, and if I lust after you, it's your fault, then yeah, you're going to feel really creeped out by men in general and by sex, even if you don't believe that all men struggle with lust.
Right. I think it might be, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it might be from For Women Only that mentions the Rolodex
Yes, it
of
is. Yes.
images that men have in their heads.
Uh-huh.
I learned
Mhm.
the word Rolodex because of that.
You
I
didn't grow
learned
up that I'm
I
old enough
didn't
that
grow
I
up with
grew up
one.
with it. I'm old enough that I did. I think she took it out of the updated one and she calls it like the photo files now instead of the
Mm-hmm.
Rolodex. But yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, with the media. But
Hmm.
I assumed that was true. And I am now married, and it turns out that my husband doesn't picture images in his head.
Yeah.
Like, that's not how he works for anything. Like, if you say picture an elephant, he doesn't see in his mind's
Hmm.
eye something. He like describes it differently. And I was like, okay, well, that broke my whole understanding of what I thought you think about.
Yeah.
Um, so it was interesting to me too to just experience that on a personal level, that it's not even not true in the way that it's presented. But for me specifically, that is not how it would apply in my relationship anyway. Um,
Yeah, and her whole book For Women Only got so big. I think it's sold like 2 million copies now. And like it's largely she claims that she's a Harvard educated researcher, Shanti Feldin, and that these books are based on research. And she did. She had a nationally representative survey of 1,000 women. So it wasn't based on Christian women or Christian men. It was just nationally representative. But her questions are so awful. Like they would not pass any academic review. And I think this is one of the things that frustrates me to no end is that she actually published her questions in the book and nobody said, wow, that's a really poorly worded question. Um, you know, like just as an example, she had one where, and this was in From and Only, she asked men, so you're alone in a train station and a really good looking, like hot woman walks up. How likely are you to, catch a glance at her? And like one of the options was I stare at her openly and drool forms on my lower lip. Like that's not, you could never get away with that in an actual academic study. But all of her other options were simply like, I take a peek out of the corner of my eye or something. Like honestly, okay, Karen, if you were on a train station and there was a really good looking woman beside you, would you take a peek out of the corner of your eye?
yep.
Yeah, like it doesn't mean anything, right? Like if there was a baby crying on the bench beside you, would you take a peek out of the corner
Right.
of your eye? If someone was
Do
walking
you
with
know
a service
things
dog,
happening
like
around
yeah,
you?
like it doesn't mean it's sexual, and yet that is the question.
Mm-hmm.
That this whole idea that men can't help but look, and men are just always thinking sexually about the women around them is based largely on that question. There's a couple of other ones too, but they're just as badly worded. It's like that doesn't mean anything.
Right. And it's so hard because I remember how, like, where I was in my life when I was reading it for the first time. Um, and I wouldn't have even thought to question that in that stage of my life, in my, upper teens, younger 20s. Um, I was like, oh, information, you
Hmm.
know. Um, And so
And you
just
shouldn't have had to. You
right,
shouldn't have had to. But pastors were recommending this book.
right.
Counselors were recommending this book. It's even used in some seminaries as curriculum. I've seen,
Hmm.
and this is the thing, like we should be doing better as a church. So I'm not
Absolutely.
blaming the women who read it, but the fact that it went so big is because like the American Association of Christian Counselors has really pushed it. Like these huge organizations of people who should know better and who should
Hmm.
know what real research is. Nobody said, that's really not okay.
Yeah,
So that's one of the things we're really dedicated to is like raising the bar on what counts as research. Like we should be doing this stuff to high standards.
right, right. Which I think is, you know, true of everything in the
Mm.
like Christian world versus non-Christian world. We should be following standards
Yeah. Yeah.
as well. Yeah. Um, so, with that, I have had a couple people ask me a few questions. Are you okay with taking
Yeah.
questions
Yeah, for
from
sure.
friends and family? Okay. So one of the questions is, do you have any advice on someone who has maybe like started in this journey, looking at healing from some of the messages that they've been taught, but their partner isn't there yet?
Yeah, that's tough, eh? And I do. I have a lot of people in this situation. I think when it's the woman who is rethinking a lot of this, what often happens is that it actually affects the sexual dynamics in their relationship. So, one of the things that we measured, like I said, was the obligation sex message, the idea that a woman is obligated to give her husband sex when he wants it. A lot of our books even taught the 72-hour rule that men need sex every 72 hours and you need to give it to them every 72 hours. And we talked to so many women in our focus groups who believed that, who were initiating every 72 hours. A lot of the books, the bestsellers that we looked at even talked about giving sexual favors every 72 hours postpartum because you can't expect him, in your postpartum period to remain faithful and not watch porn if he's sexually frustrated. So, this is really widespread. And the problem is that if that is the dynamic in your marriage, that's actually hurting you and it's hurting you as a couple. And
Mm-hmm.
even if he doesn't see it, that dynamic does have to be addressed. And so, I just want to say to women, you have permission to say no. You do. You
Right.
have permission to say no, and nobody needs to consent to one-sided sex that makes you feel used and empty. Biblically, sex is something which is mutual, intimate, and pleasurable for both. It's not just merely intercourse where he climaxes and she doesn't, and she feels used. And
Right.
yet 18% of evangelical women said their primary emotion after sex is feeling used. Like, that's terrible.
Yes. Yeah.
And we have a 47-point orgasm gap, by which I mean that 95% of men almost always reach orgasm in a given sexual encounter compared to just 48% of women. So that's a lot of one-sided sex going on. So I would just say, if you're realizing this isn't right, it's okay to say to your spouse, look, I want to have a passionate sex life with you, but I am no longer willing to be treated like an object. And so when you're ready to explore how we can make sex something which is good for both of us, I'm there.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to be used. And you're allowed to say that. Now, if that would get you in danger because you're in an abusive marriage, please, call a domestic violence hotline, see a licensed counselor first, get a plan to walk through this with someone. But that's what I would say. For a lot of people, though, it's not at that limit. It's not that level. It's just that sex hasn't been great, and their husband believes a lot of the lust stuff and modesty stuff and porn stuff. And that's where you just have to keep talking and just saying to him, it makes me feel, or I feel really um, yucky when you say that you can't, that if a woman is dressed a certain way, you can't help but lust after her. Because I
Mm-hmm.
think lust is a choice, and I don't like the idea that you are treating other women like they're objects. On behalf of my fellow women, that's really icky and
Right.
terrible. And you should not be treating women like that because Jesus didn't.
Mm-hmm.
and maybe this is something that we should address, and you can just speak up.
Right. Right. Being able to communicate what
Mm-hmm.
you're feeling and thinking. Yeah, that's good. Another question is, as we now have this research available to us, thank you to you and your team, how do we then go forward in teaching? What I've personally seen is that either we teach this like full purity culture,
Mm-hmm.
like mainline thing, or we just don't talk about it
Yeah.
because we don't know what to do. So can you share a little bit about what we could be doing instead?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really what She Deserves Better, our next book, grew out of, because so many people were like, okay, so I don't want the purity culture stuff. I don't want the toxic stuff, but now I don't know what to say to my kids because I don't want, I don't want to tell them all these terrible things, but I also don't want to say, hey, you're 14, go do whatever you want. So
Right.
where's the balance? And so we went back and we surveyed another 7,000 women for She Deserves Better to look at what messages affected them as teens. And I think if I could sum it up, it would just be that anything that is fear-based or control-based or robs girls of their autonomy is really, really dangerous. But things that celebrate intimacy and respect and wholeness are good. And anything information-wise is good. Like 40% of women did not know that the female orgasm existed until they were 18 or older. And the younger you were when you knew there was such a thing as a female orgasm, the more likely you were to orgasm in your marriage. So we have been doing sex ed really wrong.
Yeah.
People in my generation, so I'm Gen X, people in my generation had better sex ed than millennials did in the church because we just did this big 180 where the only thing we said was don't do it. And more information, there is no downside. So we studied this a lot in our survey for She Deserves Better. We looked at, we asked if they knew certain vocabulary words. We asked if they understood consent. We talked about learning about their period. Like we did a deep dive into this. And basically there is no downside to knowing more stuff. They're going to have fewer sexual partners. They're going to engage in less risky behavior. They're less likely to marry an abuser. They're going to have higher self-esteem. They're going to have higher marital satisfaction long term. They're going to have higher sexual satisfaction long term. Like there's nothing wrong with it. So we need to get back to telling kids information.
Mm-hmm.
But then the big thing is like when we are talking about this stuff, we absolutely must talk about sex in terms of intimacy and connection and not in terms of this is a drive. You're just going to need release and you've got to figure out a way to have release in a good way. And if you can't have it in a good way, then just don't have it because it makes sex into something that is so animalistic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not good. So we have to find a way to talk about, sexual desire and drives in a way that's healthy and points people to connection rather than just as, okay, this is something really ugly that you need to manage. And the way you manage it, if you're a boy, is by making sure the girls around you are doing the right thing because we can't expect you to manage it on your own because you're hopeless.
Right. Right. Yeah. One of the things we talked about in our summer study, which my husband did help lead with me, but was intimacy and like a fully knowing of one another. And I think taking into that instead of just taking the, small piece of intercourse, that's not the whole story, or shouldn't be the whole story. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Have you started to see any kind of change since putting out your research in the church?
I think there really has been a groundswell movement. It's so interesting because, the bigger media organizations, the big denominations, the big conferences, they don't like me because I'm calling out all these big names, right? So, but the book is selling pretty well and it is largely a grassroots thing because people read this and they're like, yes,
Mm-hmm.
this is what I always knew. This doesn't make sex sound ugly and dirty, and it doesn't make me feel awful, but it still celebrates something which is passionate. Like this is what I always knew it was meant to be. It's just it's not the way it's been talked about. And I am seeing a lot of people really push back on two messages, especially on social media. Like not push back at me, but when other people give the obligation sex message, I'm seeing people jump in there and say, no, that's why evangelical women have higher rates of sexual pain. Like,
Hmm.
no, women's orgasms matter too, and we're not supposed to be having one-sided sex. So I'm seeing so much of that, even in conversations that I'm not a part of. I'm just watching.
Hmm.
And that wasn't happening a couple of years ago. And the other big area is in the modesty idea. Whenever people tell women they need to cover up to stop men from sinning, people jump in and say, hold on a second. She is not responsible for his sin. And we need
Hmm.
to put this back in the right place. So that is good to see. I also am seeing a lot of counselors embrace it because counselors are seeing all the people that are hurt by our
Yeah.
messages. And they know the harm that's being done. And so counselors are really embracing the book, and some pastors are too. And so I do have hope that it will infiltrate, but I think it's largely going to be because individuals like you read it and then do studies in their churches and get stuff
Hmm.
changing. Because I don't think it's going to be a top down. I think it's going to be a bottom up.
Hmm. Well, good. I'm glad that there is movement in a positive direction. But, all right. For someone who is like brand new to this idea that maybe everything or maybe most of the things that I was taught about this are, why I have pain with sex or why I'm feeling this way or why this is a difficult thing for me or why it's difficult for me to talk about with someone. Um, do you have a good like starting place for someone?
Well, obviously, I would say read the book, but and I don't say that because I want to sell the book, but honestly, like, okay, everyone just go to Amazon, find the Great Sex Rescue, and look at the reviews. I think there's probably about 2,300 of them by now, and people are just saying how freeing it is, and I really think it is. Just it's validating. It's like,
Hmm.
oh, okay, I don't have to believe that anymore. So please just go look at the reviews because I think that will help. Um, but I would just say it's okay. It's okay to tell the truth about what you're feeling. Because as women, especially, men get this too, but as women, especially, we are told you're not supposed to tell the truth. Now, people don't say that, but what they do say is, you need to be selfless and giving. And so if he wants sex, why would you turn him down? Right? Or, you're not supposed to deprive him. And marriage is supposed to be hard. So you're supposed to be trying more. And this is all meant to refine you and make you more selfless. Um, and so over and over again, we're told that what we are feeling doesn't matter. And God is actually upset at us if we acknowledge what we're feeling because we're just supposed to plow ahead anyway, regardless. And that does not bring you intimacy. It actually doesn't. Because intimacy is allowing yourself to be fully known and fully knowing the other person. But if you have to cover up everything you're feeling, then they don't really know you. You aren't going to feel known. We talked to one woman in the focus group, and she said she had dutifully had sex for like every 3 days of her whole marriage for like 14 years. And then one day she just stopped because she broke. And we heard this actually statistically happens a lot. We could watch it happening in our survey data. You can sustain that for so many years and then it just breaks. Usually not at 14 years, usually it's closer to 20, but people can't sustain it for decades and decades. But she said the breaking point was one night, like her husband was done and he just said, I love how close we feel after this. And the whole time she was trying not to cry during sex because she just felt so distant from him. And her thought was, how can he not even know what I'm feeling?
Hmm.
Like, how can he not even know? And she realized the reason he never knew was because she never told him, but he also wasn't curious about it.
Right.
And it's like, it should have been blatantly obvious that she wasn't enjoying herself. But, in our church culture, we're not taught that women are supposed to enjoy themselves. We're taught that women don't really want sex. And so if she's just lying there, showing no enthusiasm, that's not necessarily a red flag to him that something's wrong, because that's kind of what we've been taught women do.
Right.
But she just couldn't do it after that. And this is the problem when we cover up our feelings, when we cover up what we're really feeling. We're not enhancing intimacy. We're merely giving him more climaxes. And we're allowing him to feel connected to us without actually doing any of the work of connection.
Right.
And that doesn't result in good fruit in your marriage.
Mm-hmm. It actually deprives both of you of intimacy.
Yeah.
So bringing that up, a lot of your research, or most of that I'm familiar with, has been done with women. Is there any plan for research with men?
We actually did do a survey of men, of 3,000 men, for our book, The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex.
Okay.
And so we have the Good Girl's Guide. I rewrote that. I begged my publisher. I said, I can't stand behind the 2012 edition now, even though it's selling really well. I couldn't stand behind it anymore after we did. So I begged them to let me rewrite it, and they did. They didn't pay me for it. I rewrote an entire book. And then we also wrote The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex. And, in that book, or in those survey findings, the same messages that were harmful to women were also harmful to men. And in terms of less marital satisfaction, less sexual satisfaction, they tended to make men a lot more dissatisfied with their wives. So it's not that men didn't orgasm. It's just that they were less satisfied with the amount of adventure that she showed. They were less satisfied with how much she initiated. They were just less satisfied in general with their wives, the more they believed the toxic messages. So the messages just really led to entitlement in a lot of cases. But the really interesting thing is that with guys, we tried to dig down deep on the lust message. And about 75% of men did say that they have a daily struggle with lust. But then we gave them multiple scenarios and we asked them what they would do. And of those 75% of men, just about half of them didn't lust in any scenario we gave and aren't currently watching pornography. So it's like, okay, what exactly is your struggle with lust then? Because we see no evidence of it. And I think what's happening, and this was our big thing we were trying to test, is that we have so conflated noticing a woman with lusting that guys think they're lusting if they notice that she has breasts, which is a terrible thing to put on guys too, especially young guys, as they're just, the hormones are surging, they're going through puberty, and now they hear that, if you as so much as see a girl, you're going to lust. Well, how can they avoid that? And so I think that's why all these modesty rules get put in youth group, because we've confused noticing with lusting. So I think a lot of men would feel so much relief if we could just say, no, lust is actually using someone for your own gratification mentally. And it's objectifying them. It's wanting to possess them. It's thinking of them as an object. Lust is not noticing someone as pretty.
Right. And once you start believing that, then you link shame to every sexual thought, encounter.
Yep.
Everything.
But think about the Christian quote unquote method for getting over lust, as Every Man's Battle does, is to bounce your eyes. Okay. So Every Man's Battle, those book series sold 4 million copies, and that's their big thing. You got to bounce your eyes. So if you see a pretty woman, you bounce your eyes away. They even had this horrible article on their website on how to fight lust, and you need to name your enemies. Okay, so you need to make a list of your enemies, and among your enemies are female coworkers and female joggers. So they're calling women just going about their business your enemy. It is so dehumanizing and objectifying, and so the opposite of what Jesus did. Because Jesus didn't refuse to look at women. Jesus chose to truly see women. Yeah. And we're teaching men that women are the problem. So whether you bounce your eyes or whether you lust, you're still seeing women merely as objects, not as people.
Right.
So if we're going to be like Jesus, we need to just treat women as people with respect and not just as body parts.
Right. Which is comes to the bottom line of, kind of all of this is treat people the way Jesus treated them.
Yep.
Treat your spouse the way Jesus would treat them.
Yep.
In your communication, in your,
Mm-hmm.
honesty, in your care for them. Be caring of one another. All right. Is there any question that you would want to answer today, or anything that you would want to share with us that I haven't asked?
I think I've been in this conversation on social media lately where people are saying we just need to teach people to look at scripture better, and the problem is we're just not interpreting scripture right. And so, we just, as we're talking about marriage, we just need to teach people to be more discerning about scripture. I thoroughly disagree. It's not that I don't think scripture is important, but everybody who wrote those terrible books, Tim LaHaye, when he wrote The Act of Marriage, which called a rapist husband equally unhappy as his rape victim, okay?
Mm-hmm.
He thought he was treating scripture correctly. Emerson Eggerichs, when he wrote Love and Respect, which scored 0 out of 48 on our rubric of healthy sexuality, it couldn't have been worse. He thought he was handling scripture correctly. I think we should actually take Jesus at his word in Matthew 7. And in context, what was happening was people were giving false teaching. And Jesus was teaching how it is that you're supposed to recognize who is a false teacher. And that's when he talks about looking at the fruit. Because a good tree doesn't bear bad fruit, and a bad tree can't bear good fruit. So by their fruits, you will recognize them. And I think part of the problem is that in the evangelical church, we have written whole books without ever looking at any evidence. We have just let someone talk about Bible verses from their own personal opinion as if this is God himself. And your interpretation of scripture is not equal to scripture.
Mm-hmm.
But people will teach an interpretation of a verse and then say, like the do not deprive verses in 1 Corinthians 7, to preach obligation sex and to say, therefore, women can't refuse. And it's like, no, that's your interpretation. But that is not scripture. That is not, on par with scripture. And this
That
is
doesn't
why,
line up with who.
yeah, this is
who
why
Jesus
when we're
is.
when we're trying to figure out what scripture really says, we do what Jesus says and we look at the fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And as a Christian church, we haven't done that. We have allowed people with no real qualifications, except that they're a pastor, to write books about sex without using any peer-reviewed research, without looking at the fruit. And it needs to stop. We need to raise the bar on what counts as advice in the Christian church. And that doesn't just
Mm-hmm.
include about marriage and sex. It includes about mental health, about
Mm-hmm.
emotions, about parenting, about relationships in general. Look at the fruit. And look at the qualifications of the people who are writing. Because we've done a lot of harm, and it's time to undo it.
Absolutely. I will say, too, that I think the people in my life growing up, I don't think ever intended for messages to reach me the way that they did, or for me to internalize them the way that I did. But they were swept up in this culture, this movement, and it almost feels like, okay, as this becomes like trending or whatever, if you're not a part of this, then are you really a believer? Are you really teaching well? If you don't get on, the Focus on the Family bandwagon, or, whatever the next thing is. And so I think it does take courage and integrity to step away from that, and to say something different than what it seems like all of the, mega churches or large evangelical corporations are saying.
Yeah, exactly. And it is going to take courage. I think back, you think about the year 1528, okay? What would it have looked like to have been a real Jesus-believing Christian? What would you have done? Because the Reformation had come through. A lot of people were rejecting the Catholic Church, but there weren't new churches yet,
Mm-hmm.
right? The establishment was still largely Catholic. And so and this isn't meant to be Catholic bashing. It's just at the time the Catholic Church was really corrupt. Okay. But, where would you have gone to church? What would you have done? You would have felt really alone. And I think we're living through a time of that where, we know that what the powers that be, like Focus on the Family and some of the big denominations and stuff coming down from above, has been toxic. But what do we do in the meantime? And it's a lonely place to be because God is shaking the church right now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also an exciting generation to be in. And so even though it's lonely and even though it's hard, um, we have the great privilege, I think, of seeing a massive change happen. And that will happen when we speak up and when we say, no, we're not going to do it that way anymore because we know that's wrong. And so we are going to do this new thing, even if we're not quite sure what it's going to look like or where it's going to lead us. We're going to go in faith because we know who Jesus is and we're going to follow him and see where we land. And every generation has that challenge. I think this generation has it to the nth degree. But it'll be interesting. And I think millennials were the ones who were the most hurt by purity culture. And so I think it's going to be millennials that are going to lead us out. And I'm excited to see what that generation does.
Me too. All right. Well, would you like to share with us where people can find your information? We will link it in your guest portal at the Ministry Misfits website. But where else can we find you and your work?
Yeah, so I'm at baremarriage.com. So that's BARE, baremarriage.com. We have the Bare Marriage podcast every Thursday. If you go to baremarriage.com, my social media links are there. I'm quite active on Instagram, especially, and Facebook. There's links to our books, The Great Sex Rescue, She Deserves Better, Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex. And I blog pretty much every day. So yeah, come on over to baremarriage.com and you'll find everything there.
Fantastic. And we will have all the links for you for all of that too. I also wanted to remind the listeners that November is Giving Month. And so anyone who does the Patreon support for Ministry Misfits this month is going towards Tikva, which is an after-school program. So anybody that wants to support through Patreon, that's where it's going this month for November. All right. Anything else you would like to share, Sheila?
I just want to thank people again. This really has been a grassroots movement, so it's just always encouraging when people send me notes and to hear how things are resonating. So I'm so glad that you did that study in your church too, and that's what's going to change the church. So don't be afraid to speak up.
All right. Thank you so much for coming today and talking with me, as well as, like I said before, just for stepping out and doing this in a sometimes very lonely place, but doing the research, going the long way around to get to the truth, and then not being afraid to say it.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/Ministry Misfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits.